Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well. I just wanted to say as a thought that I had, remember that if there's bad times, it's extremely important just to focus on getting through them and putting in the work, whatever you need to do at the time to make things better. Because oftentimes especially if you're mentally unwell, it's out of your control how you feel during them, especially if you know that you've done everything to help. So something I find extremely useful is just focusing on getting through it and making sure I put the work in. Because the way I look at it is I could have a time that I feel really down and I get nothing done, or have a time where I'm down but I've also managed to get through it doing work and it leads me to a better position. And overall it helps me in the long run, like massively. And remember too, if you don't feel right, even if you just think it's a little thing that might be wrong with you, make sure you go and seek professional help for it. I mean, I remember the first time I've become aware that I had severe social anxiety after years of suffering from it was literally just because a random video got suggested on it, but I had no idea what it was. And the second I got help, it was unbelievable, especially with that. So I really recommend anyone, even if you just have a suspicion that something isn't right, it might not be right, and it might just be masked through time and you thinking it's normal. Like for me, I just thought, oh, I'm naturally an anxious person and that's just how I am and have been all my life. But I didn't realize cognitively I was actually dysfunctional in that sense. Well, not dysfunctional, but you know what I mean. But yeah, I just thought that might help someone. So I hope you enjoyed this confirmation. I love you and I'll speak to you soon. Road to 100k, we almost there. Let's go. This happened in the summer in northern Ontario, Canada, near the town of Parry Sound. Me and my friend had headed up north to spend some time at my grandpa's cabin. He shares it with a few other hunters next to a very big lake. You need to take a boat to get to the cabin, I mean. I had gone up there a few weeks prior just to wander around and help my dad with some repairs and improvements to the cabin. I looked on a printout of a satellite map, and I found the area that the cabin's in. There was no Wi-Fi in the cabin, and it's sort of in a valley, and it was very hard to get any sort of signal in. And I noticed that there was a small lake north of the one we're at, and there was a small island inside the lake. Me and my dad go to the boat and found a nice pristine little island. We don't actually go on it though. We can see that there's some swampy areas and a small fiberglass boat that hunters use to hunt ducks sometimes. The lake was much higher than the one we come from, and it would have been impossible for us to take the boat that we just come in to get up the hill. Me and my friend head back to explore the island. We headed up the hill and noticed there's a small gorge that led into the lake. It used to be a river but was blocked up by a beaver dam. Me and my friend start to walk through it, and I start to feel uneasy because of the increase of bugs in the gorge, and being slightly afraid of running into a beaver. It turns out my friend was feeling the same too, and we don't know why. He just felt that there was something weird about the lake. We left the gorge and made our way up to the top of the hill. We overturned the boat, and after a few failed attempts of trying to launch the boat, we make it to the lake. Now I must say that I'm almost 6'4" and my friend's 5'7", so it's a challenge to get us in the boat, along with there only being one oar. We eventually made our way to the middle of the lake, aiming for the island, with my friend rowing the boat. We both feel very uneasy, but I put my mind off and try and distract myself a bit. Now, I'm bored, and being in a small boat, see if we could tip over if one of us sneezed for a laugh. We're almost 2 hours away from a town or hospital though, so we're both kind of worried about getting stranded at the time. We're in the middle of the lake with a small swamp in front of us, and a rock face around 20 feet from our left, and the woods to the right. We could see the water around us moving, the wind creating a slight wave. We carefully looked below us to see if we had hit a sandbar, but we didn't see any sand beneath us, just inky black waters of the lake. We put the oar in the water and don't feel any current. We found though that we could move to the left and right, but just not forward, almost like we hit an invisible wall in a game. We both felt that the boat starts to sink down a little, almost like being sucked into the lake. Now, my friend started to row to the right and we make our way to the right, then once near the coast to the island. Far away from the island, seems to be nice and pristine, but once we get closer, it's desolate. The trees are dying, or dead. The island's covered in stone and pine needles and dead lichen, with swamp and decay covering the lake. We managed to tie up the boat next to a dead pine tree, and we spend some time on the island checking it out and looking for anything of interest. After spending some time on the island and running out of bug spray, we decided to head back to the cabin. My friend took the oar and started to prod the water around off the island to find a good place to stay. Around this time, we both get this grave sense of unease. Personally, it felt like dread, kind of mixed with anxiety, like your body saying, "Get out of here now or you're gonna die." We then hear some commotion in the water, and we look around, and 10 feet away from us we see some geese running into the water. And we look around, and right where they've come from, we see what appears to be a black scuffle / scroll behind some rocks. Kind of like a mix, I guess. The closest thing I can describe is the thing in Star Wars when Jawas go behind the rocks. My friend also said he heard a strange noise, but I didn't notice it. We also had noticed too that the lake had gotten awfully still, and that the forest fell silent. We found a good place to port, and we decide we're going to row back. As we start heading back, I look to where we started and see a strange black figure staring at us standing where we left. At this point, I didn't want to point it out, so just start rowing. I row for another 10 minutes and take a short break. But whenever we take a break, we could hear the crushing of leaves and breaking of branches following us in the woods. I hug the coast as we head back. Even when we're staying around 12 feet away from the shore, I can't see the bottom of the lake. We eventually got back and put the boat back where we found it. When we tipped it over, we find scratch marks all over the bottom of the boat as though something clawed it. As we start to leave, we decide to take one last look at the beaver dam. That's where we noticed there was a cave behind the dam. Upon seeing this, we decided to get the hell out and make our way back to the main lake, where we used our walkie-talkies to tell my granddad to come and pick us up. He's out with some hunting friends and we can't even get a signal at first, but eventually find him. Now as we left, I looked back and saw the figure standing on the island later that night too, as me and my friend were at a fire pit next to the cabin. We start hearing strange noises coming from the woods, almost sounding like a person trying to make a hoot sound of an owl. Although this could have just been my grandpa's hunting buddies in the cabin, but why would they do that? Now the land itself used to be Owaja, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any kind of story similar to mine. At first, I'm sorry for any mistakes. English isn't my first language. So as a child, I had a very traumatic experience. You can believe it or not, but this is what happened to me and why I'm still scared of the dark. When I was younger, I can't say exactly how old I was, about 4 I think. My big brother and I loved to camp outside our home. In front of the house there was a small forest. If you went outside, you stood directly in front of this really small forest. There was never anything spooky about it. We even played in it. Even when it was just a steep slope with trees, it was our favourite place to be, just playing, doing stupid things. Being a child, it was always my favourite place and a happy one. One day, we decided to camp outside again. We build the tent at night and we're inside it keeping warm. Everything looks normal. I'm not afraid at all. Also, brave enough to be like 15 meters to the entrance of a toilet in the middle of the night. I went in. A few minutes later I come back. I don't even look at the forest whatsoever. Do you know the feeling like somebody's watching you? Well, I have that. I had the feeling that I need to stop and look in the forest, so I stopped. I stopped to look at the forest, and there's two glowing red eyes staring back at me. I was frozen in fear, and I ran back to the tent into the safety, shivering in fear. Now, I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't a car because there's no roads nearby, and my brother said he saw them too, so I know it wasn't just me. It couldn't have been a predator because there was no light to make the eyes reflect, and they were far too big. I've literally never seen anything like it, and I always get scared of forests today because of it. There is something my sister experienced about a week ago, which was similar to an experience a friend of hers had a month before. She was sleeping at her boyfriend's house, which backs onto a mountain with a forest starting in his backyard, when she decided to go get herself some food from upstairs. Her boyfriend refused to go with her as he had school in the morning and it's already 1. His room's in the basement, so she went up the stairs to the kitchen, on the same level as the rest of the family's bedrooms. Because she didn't want to wake up everyone else, she used her phone flashlight while she prepared herself bananas and hummus. While doing so, she heard what sounded like large footsteps. It actually sounded like a dog, but they don't have any pets. The door opens and closes about 3 or 4 times before finally closing. Then, the footsteps progress down the hall in her direction to a closet door where the same thing happened. Only this time, the door was left open. She's starting to get freaked out now. She tries to brush it off as a family member and went back to chopping her banana. Out of the corner of her eye though, she saw what appeared to be a very large black figure slowly leaning its way around the hallway corner, trying to look into the kitchen. She looked up, and it's gone. The same thing happened again. Only this time its neck is stretched out longer than before, looking at her. She looks up and finally catches a glimpse of something with white glowing eyes before disappearing around the corner. At this point, she's freaked out and grabs her knife. She quickly went around the corner to turn the light off, before gathering all of her stuff to head downstairs. When she told her boyfriend in the morning, he told her that the closed door is not just a closet door, it's an empty room with the attic door in the ceiling. They went in the room the next day to find that paint had been scratched off the attic door, and the floor was scratched beneath it. A friend of hers had a similar incident a month or so earlier when he was taking a leak in the backyard. He looked up only to see a tall creature with what he described to be glowing eyes and huge teeth standing amongst the trees. Once it notices him, it ran off, but then started coming after him once he started running towards the house. I work out in a very isolated stretch of the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and I've had an alarming amount of strange experiences while out here. The basic thing that happens are humans screaming far away in the woods. It's a really dense rainforest with no trails. Hearing high-pitched voices say 1 or 2 words like again or thank you. Sometimes I'm all alone, and sometimes my boyfriend hears them too. There is a really upsetting presence that sometimes appears to be a tall shadow that crouches and peeks out from behind things in a dumpster area, and all but a couple of co-workers have had unpleasant experiences while taking the recycling out. Another friend saw a face gliding by her window like it was on a skateboard looking in. Until recently, it's been mostly ghost happenings around here, but in the last week, we've had a few things that are different. I mean, like strange lights. The first thing that happened was my boyfriend and I are out in our bedroom and we're flooded with an intense bright light. We just stare at each other for a while, confused as to what this is. The light then flickers on and off and the room went black to pitch darkness. Our room backs off onto a dense forest, and we promptly look outside to make sure nobody's there, as this is a national forest, but there's no one. There's nothing but darkness and no movement. 2 nights ago, a co-worker of ours was returning home late at night when he got out of his car, and he can see an orange light hovering over one of the housing units. It does a couple of loops before popping out of sight. Now, the thing that worries me is that these are becoming more consistent. I spoke to a park ranger and he has no idea what they are either. I hope these stop. So a little while ago, I watched a news broadcast on my local news channel. It's about a woman that went missing 2 months ago. The circumstances of her disappearance were odd. She was staying in a family cabin in the woods, and she said she got in a shootout with 2 men, claiming she shot one in the face. She frantically called her friend and told her these things. The specific things she said is unknown. The police found bullet holes and other evidence that suggests there was a shootout, but they find no blood anywhere, despite her saying she shot one in the face. Her belongings are found, and it's all on the roof, and she's been missing ever since. There's no sense of this, it's like she literally just vanished. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even myths around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now, my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid, and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experiences night hiking, we would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now, the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and past the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road, and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet, it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail, staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. She'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone, at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. There's stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge, and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now, and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time, and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, "This feels much longer than it should be," and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, he kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail, whatever it's called, is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both of his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we're even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we were all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half, when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year, the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012, I was 16 and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "You know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this." She mentions, "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 19s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies and the long greasy hair barely holding on the top of the head starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight at my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that There's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions, and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door, and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives, and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances did they touch or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30 and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them. Because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, the trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walked into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe, one hell of a name, were outside all the time when we could manage it. Joe, the real G, lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we're frontiersmen. We'd build lots of traps, shelters, and practice making fires with sticks. Basically the whole 9 yards. Now when we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the rail tracks out in the country, But instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find a cool bridge to fish from, and camp out a little way off the track. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we're probably trespassing, but we're young and kids. Now we had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was very calm actually. Now after school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd occasionally see each other. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we're both in the same town for about a week. We'd do other stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer and a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day just to walk the trails, camp one night and walk home. The day we decided on, we started out early in the morning. We actually had my wife drop us off in the old spot we used to start in, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave her what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We sat on the bridge and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff before the night set in. We picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train track, and it made you feel as though you're in a tunnel. We brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. Now this is actually what we used to do in the old days. We'd walk the area and make sure that we're not just on some guy's house or something. We walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and end up on a small incline. We figured if we don't see anything from the top of this hill, we'll be good. But when we get to the top of the hill, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, which is barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't appear to be anyone in it. It was quiet, with no movement that we can see, no lights even. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly as we neared the building, and we see it's not a sugar shack, but it's an old church. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building with wooden planks that are busting out from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of that place, also weathered and black, looking creepy. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see the inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section for a preacher to stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't wanna. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anyone, not even footprints. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot, and we decided to camp there. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel safe, but we're still a little uneasy. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods in the middle of nowhere. Besides, at this point it's dusk and we decide to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep. By this time night set in. Now as we lay in our hammocks, we're talking and we hear something in the direction of the church. What the hell's that? It sounds like people singing. Yeah, I know, man. And it did sound like people singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down. straining to hear more. We listen for a minute or two, and they're singing, but it's not getting louder. We decide to creep back up the hill to see if we can spy on whatever that is. We could move very quietly in the woods. We're used to it from before and it's like second nature now. The moon was barely out and it provided just enough light so you couldn't really see us. We didn't touch our flashlights as we slowly got up the hill, not even whispering. We got to the top of the hill and we see a light in the distance. It was coming from the church. Singing? Well, it's from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and hushed conversations to each other. Can you hear this? I don't believe this. Craziest thing is that the light appears as though it's coming from a candle and flickering. And though we tried, we can't make out what's being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat there for a while, trying to see who was in there, but only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer. We have about a football field's length between us now. The singing has continued for a bit, but stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I'm already freaked out, but this voice scared the life out of me. It sounded like an Old Testament preacher that you see in movies, but again, speaking in another language, we can't differentiate any words. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, then a bunch of voices would answer. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into the song, which is long and sustained and gets louder and louder. It got so loud it was actually disturbing enough that I covered my ears. It stopped now. At this point, I was getting ready to say, let's get out of here, when Joe puts his hand on my shoulder and says, yeah, they're coming. We're far enough away that we can't make them out really, but we can literally see a line of figures walking out of the hallway, all in single file. Some of them have flashlights and began to sing again. They're moving towards us. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks into the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, erratically like they're shaking them. We sprint as quick as we can. We eventually stop seeing the lights and come to our road, but our map is really small and we're struggling to read it. We walk for about 15 more minutes and know where we are. We get to a gas station and my wife gets us. Now my wife and other friends say it's just kids messing around, but there was no way kids made them sounds. Not sure who these people were, but it definitely creeped me out. I remember that happening to me in Ohio. I'm doing seasonal work out in the Olympic National Park this summer and live in employee housing on the same property as my job. Throughout the summer, I've heard things like a giggling coming from an empty room and a sliding door that closes on its own. Now one night about a month ago, something wild happened. The building I live in is backed up against an impenetrable coastal rainforest, and some friends and I were sitting in one of the apartment unit cabins chatting when, all of a sudden, we hear screaming coming from directly in the woods. Initially, we thought it's a cougar, but it kept going and was decidedly human sounding. Sometimes it seemed more like a sobbing, and in others it was frantic yelling. It literally goes on for 5 minutes straight, then stops. Now the truly chilling part, about 30 seconds after the yelling stops, we heard what sounded like a disembodied woman's voice coming through a radio that starts muttering right next to where we're sitting. We can't make out what she's saying and it's only for a few seconds, but it's literally in the room next to us, and we can't see anything around. One of my friends opens the door to make sure there's nobody outside and we're completely alone. It should be added that everyone who lives in the buildings were all in the same room. Everything else was empty. Though the voice lasted for a few seconds, it stayed with me forever. When I was about 9, my family was in a big transitional phase. We moved out to a house deep in the woods in the country, and my mother to this day insists that it's haunted. My sleepwalking got really bad in those days, I mean incredibly. Sometimes I'd wake up on dirt, outside, with a blanket wrapped around me. I would look around in darkness for a light, and that would usually be my house porch light. It got so bad that my mum kind of barricaded me in at night with chairs sometimes. What scared me most, however, was not outside in the woods, near the national forest, no. It was my room. It was on the first floor, and with the layout of the house, it was on a silent kind of slanted hill. It dug into the ground a bit. It was the closest thing to a basement possible, because it dug into the ground. There was only one window in my room. This window is in the top right corner of my room, and it was tiny. The window was right at ground level outside, so most of the time I would only see thick grass and dirt covering the glass. Sometimes when I woke up in the night though, I would see other things. Often, I saw boots standing there. They would stand there for hours at a time, facing inwards as though someone's staring at the wall, facing me. They were steel-toed, or looked like old leather boots. It looked as if they belonged to a man. It was so weird. The boots shifted weight sometimes back and forth, between one side and the other, as though the wearers lean in. The toe area was always scuffed too. I knew that they weren't my mother's or father's. It wasn't sleeping paralysis. I was always able to move in that. I would just sit and stare at these boots until I fell asleep. And for some reason, I always had the urge to never go and tell someone, and I don't know why. My family's already freaking out about the other experiences in the house, so I guess I didn't want to add to it. It stopped when my dad moved. Years later, and with the family camping, and all of us are telling scary stories, my father begins talking about how when he was young, he would have the sensation that something was slowly walking towards him. Has anyone ever seen it in a movie? Yeah, like that. He just explained like a pair of shoes that slowly walked towards him with malevolent intent. He goes on to explain how it stopped when he got older. I get this sour taste in my mouth. I ask my father if they're still toes. He shoots this weird look at me and nods. I say, are they made of old, dusted leather and scuffed at the front? He looks scared now and nods. He said, how do I know? And I explain my story, and he begins freaking out. It was so insane to make these realizations at the same time. And my father's room was right above mine, so someone with average height at that specific spot would have been right through to my dad's window. I've concluded that my father has spirits that follow him. I now know that they weren't there for me. I just hope they can stop. It was mid-December 2010. I was 16. I was off school for the half term and was playing video games all day basically. I lived in a small 3-bedroom semi-detached house. Due to my bedroom being upstairs and fairly small, my mum let me have the back room downstairs as my room too. This had all things in there like my PC, reptiles and guitars. We also had some doors leading into the garden near the forest. One night at around 2 AM, I was playing World of Warcraft and using Ventural talking to my guide friends. Pretty standard night. At the time, my sleeping pattern was awful, and I was staying awake all night playing World of Warcraft. I pretty much always had my back door a little tiny bit open to let some cool air in, due to the heat coming off my computer and to cool it too. This had never been a problem. We lived in a relatively quiet area. Now, our garden backs onto a small wooded area, and the only people I ever seen in there were kids making dens and playing, etc. Nothing really to be scared of. While having headphones in, I can't really hear anything outside, because of the game volume, I mean. I remembered playing and catching something out of the corner of my eye. Now, my PC desk is about 3 feet away from the double doors against the wall. Anybody outside would be able to see me sitting at the desk. I turned and saw a hand opening the door. I froze and remembered spinning around in my chair, ripping out my headphones. This would be a pretty good time to add that I was home alone. My mum and dad were at a wedding party and I was fine staying home on my own. Then a man, who's about 30 years old with a shaved head and scruffy beard, is standing at my door. Well, we kind of stare at each other for a few seconds, and I ask him to close my door and get out of the garden. But he just casually walked in and stood there. I remembered freaking out a little and standing up and moving to the other side of the room. I moved towards a shelf where I had a penknife and took it out and tell him to go away. He then said that, and it chills me, he knew nobody was home, and says let me stay on the couch until my parents' car shows up. I'm freaked the hell out. He got visibly agitated and starts walking around my room looking at my reptiles. I told him that I'm gonna call the police. I remember not being as terrified as I should have been. It was only for the reason what the situation is that I couldn't really understand what was going on. He then said something along the lines of, "You know, I'll stab you long before the police ever get here." I remembered then going out to my room and shutting the door behind me, so he's locked in. I never heard him walk to the door or even try the handle. He then starts really pushing on it while screaming at me to move. I weigh up my options. It seemed like the best option would be to run out of the front door and knock on the neighbour's house, but my very small dog was asleep in the bedroom and I'm not going to leave him. I know my dad kept a police cosh in the cupboard in his bedroom, so I sprinted to get it. While rustling in the drawers, I hear him going upstairs. He's now making his way through my parents' bedroom, staring at me through the banister. I'm terrified. He has a steak knife in his hands now, which I didn't see before, and he raises it up to me. I had the cosh and a penknife, but I wasn't confident. He didn't move for a bit until I asked him what he planned to do, because this isn't going to end well for us. He told me he's going to go back and walk down the stairs. I heard him go through my room. I hear him slowly go through the other side. I crept back down the stairs, but what made it more intense is for some reason he turned off every single light. Before I got to the bottom of the stairs, I called the police watching the doors to see if he'd come. The police arrived 10 minutes later and my parents shortly after. They searched the woods behind my house and the fencing area, and they found some used needles, gloves, and a huge carpet roll, and about 10 cigarettes in the same place. They suggested he must have been watching me in the dark because it would have a perfect view of my room. And what's worst, they never found him. So this is something that I've kept to myself for over 2 years now, and every time I think about it, all the hairs on my body stand up. Here's something that my girlfriend and I really like to try and forget about. So my girlfriend and I really enjoyed trying to find new hikes in western Colorado. We decided to try a new trail that was not on the national monument, and was far away from any other trail. Was a good deal with the way out of town as well. Anyway, we're on one of the only car parks on the trailhead, and as soon as we're walking it, it gets really dark. Well, we make it all the way until the moon rose, and I stop to hug my girlfriend. Now, all of a sudden, further down the road, at least a few miles away, we hear automatic gunfire. It pops, then goes silent, then pops again. Now, this kind of thing isn't normal in my area. Now, my girlfriend said to me if she thought they were gunshots, and I say I don't think they are. Now, we're in the middle of the wilderness at this point. We decided it'd be best to turn back about 2 miles down the trail. Now, by this moment, we're on top of a very large hill covered in desert shrubs. As soon as we stop talking, we realise something's wrong. All of the insects had stopped chirping, and the crickets had stopped entirely. All of the sounds of nature were gone. My girlfriend was facing further down the trail, and I was facing back the way we come from. She looked behind me and screams. She then starts running. I was already scared, but I figured the worst it could be is some drunk idiot. I turned and looked, and I immediately ran after her. I never ran so fast in my life. The shrubs are about 2 or 3 feet high in varying spots, and when I turned around, I don't know how to describe it, it looks more like a shadow. Even with the moonlight directly shining on it, it's almost absence of any light. Now it's already starting to stand up when I turn around. As soon as it fully rose up, I realised that I was looking up at this thing and it had to be at least a foot taller than me. It had very clear skin, and bones that don't appear to be human. We sprinted back to my car, still with the whole trail being silent. I was in such a hurry when we ran to the car that neither of us realised that I hadn't taken out my keys to open the car. We're halfway through the drive when we realised that. Now every single hair on my body was raised, and even if I'm being honest, I've never felt anything like it. Every fibre of my body told me to get out of there, and I was almost paralysed by fear that washed over me. Does anyone know what this could have been? Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. Sorry if my voice was off in the last couple of videos. I think I said it in my other video, but I unfortunately got a recurring viral throat infection and it made it really difficult to record. I did as many as I could, but obviously it had a limit. But we are recovering now and we're probably like 70 or 80% back to normal. So I hope my voice sounds a lot more normal in these stories. And if you want early access to my stories, then make sure you check out my Patreon and make sure you check out my podcast in the description below too. And I have a quick message before the story starts. So for today, I'd like to share this. Remember that it is important to have outlets for stress and other things like that. And it's important to have people that you know that you can trust and talk to. Obviously be careful about who you choose for these things, but it might be a close family or a close friend. But I think if you keep everything in your head all day and you never release it, it's kind of where the ideas just bounce around and can become quite toxic sometimes. I know for myself, I used to think the best thing for me is to just sit on my own and think my way out of this, but all it did was made me feel much worse and ended up ruminating and spiraling down a lot. Now, if you haven't done it for a while, I'd really suggest it just to release some of the stress and pressure. And make sure that you have other things that you enjoy doing, because a balanced version of yourself is always going to be the best self, and it's going to be able to overcome the most. Even if it feels like you only want to work and work your way through things, you're going to get burnt out that way, and that's only going to lead to you feeling more down. So make sure that you have balance and do the things that you enjoy. I'm probably not always the best at doing that, and I have to really make sure that I schedule it into my week, but make sure you can do it. I think it's really important. So I hope that can help somebody, and I hope you enjoyed these stories. I'll speak to you all soon. Now, I work in a national park as a park ranger, and I remembered something that happened one evening. I'd went out near our station to drink my coffee. It's kind of a ritual that I had, and it was important for me to stay awake and alert enough to do my job effectively at night, when I hear a really loud crash. Now, not even 1 feet next to me, a huge boulder smashes into the ground. It scares me how close it is, and I jump back. Before I really have time to react to this, I hear somebody shouting at me, "Hey, watch out, the aliens are coming, man, the aliens are coming. You have to hide." And then I see somebody with a very long beard, very unkempt hair, a very old hat and clothes who sprints past me. He sprints so quick that I honestly don't think he's human for a second. Now, I stood there completely grounded. I want to say I was brave, but I just realized that this guy was probably trying to kill me with the rock. Within a second, I snap into life and I quickly get into the station, report what's just happened and call the police, and we send out our search party. Now, our party found absolutely nothing and ordered the police, so that crazy person could still be out there waiting to throw rocks at people's heads and kill them. I'm just glad that he missed me. Me and a buddy of mine had been called out to go and investigate a tent that was put somewhere it shouldn't have been. You're not supposed to camp in this part of our forest, and there was an old army green tent set up. We're almost there when my buddy stops and says, "Hey, can you hear that?" I say, "What?" I can then very faintly make out the sounds of somebody singing. The more and more I listen to it, it's children singing Ring a Ring of Hoses. It sounds like maybe 4 or 5 of them. They all have different voices. This goes on for about 2 minutes, very faintly. I turn on my flashlight and have a look around in all directions. We cannot locate where the sound is coming from. It sounds like it's right next to us. We turn off the flashlights again and it stops, and we think maybe it's coming from the tent. Quite scared now, we go closer and closer to the tent until somebody emerges. We say, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." He says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I just needed to rest for a bit," and the guy was actually really nice and said that he didn't realize he wasn't supposed to be. We then ask him, does he know where the singing was coming from? And he looks at us and says no, he was about to ask the same question. He packs up his things and we show him the way back because it's dark. We start to set off and we hear children laughing, just like before. Now the look of fear I've never seen in the other guys before. I must have had the exact same expression as we realize that something is off. We quickly scan the torches around and very quickly scan the area and can't find anything. We then make it hurriedly back to our relative safety. I did some research of the area and apparently there have been reports of similar things happening before. Children laughter in the night, but nobody's ever able to locate where the sound comes from or the accompanied singing. One of the main responsibilities I had working in my national park is to make sure that I survey the climate testing devices. I'm not in the United States of America too, so it might be different out there, but we really put a lot of emphasis onto checking the air quality and trying to maintain it. We try and keep it to the highest possible standard that we can, and it's not really easy, but we have lots of trees, which is really a good thing. Now on this particular day, I set out to check the first 3 posts and they were fine. I go into the 4th and final one and it's starting to get dark. I can then see that there's a colleague who's already there, so I don't think much of it. I just continue doing my job and do a friendly wave, but I don't get one back. I turn around and go to do my other task, hoping that this person has done it for me, expecting them to catch up with me. I then realise that they look odd. Something about the way that they're standing hunched over just doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't look like somebody who's happy and healthy, it looks like somebody who's a little bit off. I don't know, just their whole demeanour seems really strange to me. I then shine my flashlight over, thinking maybe they're in trouble, and I get the fright of my life. I'm met with something that is wearing an all dark robe, has a very weird goat kind of face, and looks like what I can only describe as the devil, with completely black eyes. It's probably about 7 feet tall, and slowly turns to face me. I drop the flashlight, and within a moment, I'm bolting the opposite direction. Eventually I make it back to the station, and I frantically explain what's happened, and some of the other guys go to check it out. We can't find anything, just my flashlight and its dying light now, because it's been out there in the cold for a while. We don't find a person or devil, but we do find something weird. There are hoof marks in the ground, exactly where I saw this thing. Weirdly, there's none leading away, just perfectly in the position that I saw this thing standing there. We never saw this thing again, but it actually is in our folklore to have things like this around, so I'm certain what I saw was probably the devil or some kind of demonic entity. The Okefenokee swamp is mostly located in South Georgia and partly in North Florida. I've been going to there since I was a kid. Now, my dad and uncle are avid outdoorsmen. They're always canoeing, hiking, hunting, fishing, etc. And I grew up learning to love the same things. Now, if the first thing that came to your mind when I said swamp was alligators, you'd be correct. This swamp has some of the biggest around. It may sound super scary to non-southerners, but the same old thing is really true. If you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone too. Now, slowly canoeing across the dark, cold waters, if you ever pass one, it will quickly sink into the muddy depths. He's not going to come and get you. You've simply interrupted his sunbathing. As elementary school kids in South Georgia, it's kind of a rite of passage to go on the swamp field trip, led by a guided tour by someone called Joe. Hell of a name. Joe was a true outdoorsman. I might be extremely knowledgeable, maybe friendly, yeah, and good with the kids and funny. A little strange, but generally regarded as a good guy, a local legend. He would get the boat closer to the big gators than my dad would ever let me get. He taught us kids all about them. We even got to hear about the mating call of some of the males and watch a lot of behaviour super close up. He would also allow us to see the birds and snakes and other wildlife. The swamp residents were so used to Joe's boat that they didn't flee when he got close. Great memories. Anyhow, fast forward to my adulthood and I still have a great love of the outdoors. I'd recently gotten married and was successfully getting my wife and stepdaughter into kayaking, camping and hiking. I'd broken them in fairly easy calm lakes with beautiful crystal clear water. Now during our time, we'd actually encountered some gators, but the girls had become fairly comfortable with the fact that they weren't going to get hunted by them. I decided it was time to go to this old swamp and show them my childhood swamp stomping grounds, so we headed out one weekend, kind of on a whim. I hadn't called ahead to reserve a campsite, but I presumed that they weren't too busy just yet. Well, I was wrong. Every tent on the campsite was booked. I was pretty visibly bummed out, so I guess the ranger felt sorry for me. She told us, hold on, she was going to get one more thing that she could check for us. When she came back, she had great news. There was a primitive group site available. If you aren't familiar, these are larger sites that are usually for big groups like Boy Scouts. These are also usually situated away from some of the larger areas and main camping grounds. They don't have electricity. We camp 100% primitive all the time though, so it wasn't an issue for us. The ranger told us that this particular group site had been closed for 2 months due to seasons actually washing out the road. Now she said that they just fixed the road the week before, but hadn't actually gotten around to relisting the site as available. She offered to sell it to us for a normal fee instead of the camp group fee deal. We pay and she vaguely shows us on the map how to get there before we get back home for the night. I remembered thinking, wow, that's pretty far from the other sites. It's gotta be nice and quiet, perfect. While at the office, we learned that evening there was going to be a ranger guided night paddle. This particular park inside of the swamp is designated Dark Sky Park, meaning very little night population and light pollution. I was already excited about showing my family the stars of Milky Way, so getting out onto the water at night and seeing the skies at the same time seemed sweet. We decided to sign up for the night paddle and then headed off to our campsite. When we got out there, you could tell right away that it hadn't been used in several years. There was overgrown spider webs everywhere, teeming with the usual wildlife. I kind of in a way prefer it this way, so don't actually think twice about it. Now, it was so far from the campgrounds and the main office area that you couldn't hear a single human voice or vehicle. The area was so large that I walked around for a bit to find a good spot to actually set up, and had a lot of choice. I then refer back to my map and I'm trying to gauge just how big the island is and what the shape of it is, and notice that what I was seeing and what the map showed don't quite line up. Whatever, I could be wrong, so we set up the camp and just enjoyed the sunshine and the sounds of nature. It was still very early spring, so hordes of mosquitoes and various other swamp bugs weren't out in full force just yet. The bugs in the swamp in the summer months could be a horror story of their own. Around 7:30, we loaded up the kayaks into my pickup and headed all the way across the park to the launch area, as our guided paddle was supposed to start at 8. Now, we approached the launch area and unload, and there was about a good 15 or 20 people ready for their paddle, led by an enthusiastic young ranger. We slipped off into the water with our headlamps on the red light setting. Now, we exit the small canal that we had been travelling in and emerge out into a large river type waterway that meandered through the swamp, and we slowly and quietly creep along, going through some of the trees which are draped in Spanish moss, which is kind of looming over us on both sides now, with a dramatic orange sunset in the back forming our backdrop. The sun then finally began to disappear and the stars began to come out. It's absolutely stunning and still one of my favourite kayaking memories. I'd never actually seen the Milky Way like that before. It was a new moon night, dark as it could be. About a mile from our original launch, we were all congregated out in the middle of the waterway and sat completely still and quiet. The motionless dark waters of the swamp actually reflect the skies like a mirror, and you can see thousands of stars and galaxies twinkling above and below us. It was like being in space, not just simply to observe it. Shooting stars are also visible every few minutes. It was really magical. The only artificial light in the sky was the dull glow of Jacksonville, Florida on the horizon, which was about 100 miles to our southeast. After a while, the ranger stopped all of us in our trances. It's time to go back. Now, when we're heading out there, it had been dusk and twilight for most of the trip. Not much light, but enough to kind of see the silhouette of trees and branches against the sky and the light glimmer on the water. But by now, it's pitch black, and I do mean pitch black. The ranger told us to switch our headlamps back on to the normal white light setting so that we can actually navigate out of the swamp. As each headlamp slowly switched on, the swamp is illuminated and met with hundreds of glowing eyes, and I mean hundreds, I swear to you. Now, as I said earlier, I grew up there. Gators are really nothing new to me or scary. However, growing up, we never stayed out on the waters past dark. We would shine our lights out and over the water to look at all the eyes, but from dry land, far away from the beasts. Now I found myself and my little family quite literally pushing past floating gators with our kayaks. They were absolutely everywhere, all over the sides of the channel as well as blocking up our way in the centre. The ranger was leading and assumed everybody wasn't going to worry and told us not to worry. He paddled up towards a huge group of shining eyes up ahead of us and actually pushes through them. Most of them disappeared under the water, but the gator directly in front of the ranger's path thrashed. His tail actually hit the kayak. Now, sharp gasps come from everyone, whereas before it was the quiet southern air, but the ranger showed no signs of panic, which was actually reassuring. We all just trusted the young man that we weren't going to annoy any of these by kayaking straight into them. As we went along, there's the sounds of gators bumping by the kayaks and thrashing heard every couple of minutes. There weren't any other jarring sounds or movements, just a constant calling of frogs and other things splashing, and other old dinosaurs there. When we finally turned back into the small channel that led to the launch, there were no more glowing eyes. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, but I can honestly say that I wasn't panicking. The ranger being so cool and confident while leading the way made it pretty easy to remain calm. Everybody started to relax again as we neared the launch and all got out. I loaded up our bows and one by one we head back to our camps. There was a line of red towel lights tailing off towards the main campground, while my wife, daughter and myself split off alone into the darkness towards the other side of the park where our site is. I do remember that kind of eerie feeling, but everybody made it through the gator area with no problems. Now we're laughing about it, remarking on how cool the experience was, basically in high spirits and no stress. We had no idea of the terror that would come later on in the night though, that is, however. So we finally get back to our site at around midnight, and we were starving. Now I got a nice fire going while my wife prepared dinner for us all. I was excited for that. The meal finishes cooking at around 1 AM, and we all finally settle down and get comfy by the fire and start to eat. Now I hadn't taken 2 bites of my food when the horrifying experience began. The frogs were singing, but you basically drown that out as background sound because it's so constant. Now suddenly, out of the calming buzz of their singing, was a sound that I'll never forget. A low rumbling, guttural growl, long and deep, vibrating our chests. We all look at each other froze like, did you all hear that? Not even 10 seconds later we hear it again. Yeah, we heard that. It sounded close, like really close, like right on the other side of the bush that we were camping next to. The only thing that I can relate it to is the sound of that T-Rex in Jurassic Park. I was terrified. I've been scared in the woods and swamps. I've seen swamp gas, freaky figures and heard screams. I've been in the Marine Corps. I've encountered bears in the Appalachian Mountains. I've explored and experienced all kinds of things. When I tell you I've never been this scared, I mean it. Pure, raw, primordial fear. I immediately told the girls to get into the cab of my pickup. They get into the truck and I hop into the bed of my truck with my little 357 Magnum drawn. I figured being back there would make it great for me to get up off the ground and have a little advantage over whatever was coming. I tell the girls to lock the doors and open the little sliding back window so we can communicate. I start frantically shining my flashlight around, aiming my gun along with it, and I see absolutely nothing. We continuously hear the growling coming from one direction, not getting any softer or louder. It just continuously emits in 3 to 5 second long intervals every 30 or so seconds. It was coming from the brush right next to our site now. I shine my lights all over the area but I met with nothing, just thick leaves, underbrush and pine. No movement though. Then suddenly, we hear the sound coming from the complete opposite direction, towards the open area of our site. I whip around and shine my light that way, and that's when I noticed the dense fog that had settled into the entire area. It was a damp, sticky, suffocating fog. Almost right away, the growling sound come back from the original direction. I whip around, but immediately I hear it behind me. I then realize there's two of them, doing a kind of call and answer with each other. That's when I realize the other sounds have gone quiet. The swamp is now silent. I hear nothing but the call and answer of whatever these are, making absolutely gut-wrenching sounds. It got deafeningly quiet for a moment, nothing but the heavy fog, which seems to have a sound of its own. Now my wife, with shaky trembling voice, told me that she wanted to leave immediately, and that our daughter agreed. Now I was absolutely terrified. Do not misunderstand this, however. The thought of just leaving all my expensive camping gear behind me was more offensive. Not to mention I'm getting kind of annoyed now. I'm very at home in this swamp and I know all of the creatures here. I'm comfortable here. It's borderline annoying me that something here scared and confused me. I start trying to rationalize what could have made the sound. Suddenly it starts up again, but there's 4 or 5 of them, all growling back and forth at each other, overlapping now from all sides. A demonic chorus of rattling, soul-sucking rumbles, not getting any closer or further away, just keeping us closely surrounded. No, I would have found it hard to believe anything could have made this sound. I now keep myself somewhat cool by saying it must be animals. I wouldn't even entertain the thought of anything supernatural or cryptic though. It's not that I don't believe in it, I'm just trying to not be scared. My wife keeps telling me it sounds like a big cat, which I agreed. I knew it wasn't. It would have had to have been massive lions or tigers to keep making that extremely low grumbling growl. Impossible. I racked my brains for the biggest animal, and it's an alligator. Yet we just paddled directly through the swarm of them. Some of them are absolutely massive, and they hadn't made a single sound that whole time when in the water. Now what could it be? I even thought of that young ranger and think maybe he's playing some kind of joke on us all here, but I doubt it. I have no idea what it could have been. I'm not even able to capture a glimpse of it so I can take a shot to protect my family. And I'm feeling helpless. I really wish I had more words of how I felt, but just blindly standing there in the back of that truck, hearing what I could only imagine are the scariest, eeriest things on the planet, it was a horrible feeling. Now, I felt like we were there for an eternity, but we'd probably been in there for about 15 minutes or so. It's finally gone quiet again. I told the girls we could leave, but not leave in my gear. I climbed into the cab and started to get the truck, go in and move things. I ended up positioning the truck where I could shine the headlights onto our stuff while I pack it all up. Gun in hand, I begin rolling up the tent, gathering all of our things together into the bed of the truck, praying nothing crazy happened like my truck dying or something else perfectly timed like that from a horror film. I tried to put on a confident air. I'm really trying not to scare my family, but in that moment I felt so vulnerable, like something's prey. The growling still hadn't come back, but honestly, the silence was freaking me out more than anything. And the fog, I'll never forget how oppressive it felt. All of our gear was sopping wet with it, and I swear it was hard to breathe the air. The fire was nothing but a smoulder, despite the fact that it had been roaring bright 20 minutes ago. Now, just as I rolled up the very last sleeping mat, there's one final, closer than before growl that shook me to my core. I snatched the mat up and took off running, getting into the truck, Duke of Hazzard style, and taking off, none of us looking back. Now for some context, I'm a Mal, and this took place when I was around 12 years old, and is probably the most terrifying night of my entire life. My name is James. My friend is called Jess. He's around 4 months older than me, but that's quite important. It was the summer of 2016 and summer vacation had just started. I was living my best life playing video games. Jess's distant grandma, that he actually never met, passed away sadly the week before, so his parents are out of town. My mum said that he could stay with us while his parents sorted out things in their hometown. Jess was staying in my room with me, which we loved. We'd actually been the best of friends for as long as I could remember, really. Now, we still are, so as teens or pre-teens do, we're intent on sleeping as little as possible each and every night. Now, one night, we decide that we're going to sneak out. Now, this isn't for any miraculous purpose. For some reason, we just like the thrill of knowing that we'd been wandering around my block while my parents were asleep and didn't know we're out. Now, my parents are usually preoccupied with my older brother and sister anyway. So, we finally get out and went to the local park just to chill for a while. That's when we hear something that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think of it. There's a woman scream. It didn't sound like it was that far away from where we are. Immediately, I regretted sneaking out and thought that we should run back home. But Jess wanted to investigate. He said that he was worried that somebody was getting hurt. And so I reluctantly agreed to go out and search for the source of the scream. We thought that the scream sounded like it was coming from the other side of the small forest, but we're too afraid to walk through it, so we go to the edge of the tree line. That's when we saw a woman crouched over something up ahead. She was actually facing in the other direction too, and Jess called out, "Ma'am, you okay?" And she didn't move. We didn't respond. Her hands looked bloody. We slowly moved towards her and say, "Ma'am, are you alright?" Jess said, lightly poking her back. She turned around and vomited up a liquid. It was dark brown and smelled like rusty metal. Even worse, there was something moving inside of it. We just froze and neither of us had a clue what to do. She just looked at us with this grunt face and cloudy eyes. She then runs and turns directly into the forest. Now we then see that she's been eating what appears to be a rotten deer. How that's possible I don't know. We both looked at each other and ran home. We were so scared that we didn't sleep at all that night. Whoever she was, we never saw her again. Weirdly, there's no reports of a crazy woman being found living in the forest off of the land too. We still don't understand what we saw. I can, however, say that I'm very grateful she didn't harm us and that I wasn't there alone. Now, my story took place in North Italy back in 2014 in early September. A friend of mine proposed me to make a short hike in the woods near his town, and I obviously agreed, since I love nature. We prepared our backpacks and grabbed some food and drove to the place. My friend knew the area very well, so we didn't take a map. We didn't have flashlights neither. Now, we've planned to return while there's still some daylight, and it's in early September, so daylight lasts pretty long still. As we get deeper into the woods, we saw beautiful spots, small rivers, and a pair of caves that we explored. We had lunch and proceeded to follow a trail in a deeply wooded area. After around half an hour, we were at the point about 50 minutes away from the car when we stopped so that we can take some photos and explore the area. We then arrive at a pretty large clearance, and here comes the weird part. In the clearance were a bunch of people, around 4 or 5 dressed normally. They were simply talking and laughing, nothing too weird about it, so it didn't raise alarm bells. They weren't praying in a circle or doing dreadful chants, just like super ordinary people like me and my friends just talking to each other. They obviously saw us too, since the clearance had no trees or rocks to cover the view and we couldn't avoid that. Since the trail, after a deep curve, immediately ends into a clearance, proceeding to the other side of it, we approach and we said, "Hey, what's up?" And they didn't answer and just stare back at us, not really saying a single word. Obviously, that's a big red flag. We stopped too, and I look at my mate. He looked back at me concerned too. We said again, hey, and there's no answer. I start feeling very uneasy, so we decide to return back to the car. But soon after we moved, we realized that they're actually following us, and we yelled, "Why are you following us? Did we do something wrong?" Yeah, we're still pretty young now, and don't really know what to do. Now, usually you should run immediately. Now, obviously, we proceed to walk faster and try to get out of the trail. Another pretty bad choice, but my friend knew the area well. But everywhere we went, they followed with about a distance of 15 meters. We start to panic, so we looked again to each other and agreed that we have to get out of here quickly now and soon begin running. We heard that they started running too, and obviously it makes us scared. We made our best possible way out of there, putting more distance between us and them. Another thing that made me panic was the fact that, as we said, we're about 40 minutes away from the car at that point and in a pretty isolated area, so I felt really hopeless. At a certain point, when we're about halfway back, we start to notice that they aren't behind us anymore. We thought maybe that we were lucky and managed to lose our tracks, but unfortunately, I don't think that was the case. We ended up hiding behind a thick bush and tried to listen, and there's silence, no footsteps nor voices. And keep in mind that even when they're following us, they don't say a word. So we took our breath back and managed to return to the car, trying to be as quiet as possible. We jumped in the car and raced out of there, but it doesn't end yet. As we left the woods onto the main road, we saw someone coming from a secondary road, and suddenly another car appears behind us, following us again. They were surely never going to lose us now. But we're certain it's the same people because 1, they were hightailing us, and 2, the area is very rarely visited, and there's basically no cars except for my friend's one, and this doesn't have plates. We drove to my friend's town, avoiding going to his house and taking every country road, and every time we made, they did as well. As we reach the town's ingress, they actually make a U-turn and just return back to the woods. Terrified, we immediately called the police and informed them the people were in a small car and where they were heading to. Now, the police said that they showed up and did some investigation but never found anything. I was actually so scared that I ended up taking a 4-year break from hiking after this. Now, this encounter happened many years ago when I was very young, in 2001 or 2, and I was like 11 or 12 at the time. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I don't know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and myself decided to accompany him one Saturday to scope the property. From our home, it was a little more than a 3-hour drive, but we all love riding in the car, so while it was not going to be the most eventful road trip, we were just excited to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remembered being very underwhelmed with the place. No houses nearby, not even signs of life really, apart from a few birds, and the wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque. So we eventually parked the car off the road and go exploring the woods a bit. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting, which isn't really my cup of tea. As we walked through the woods, it was a very nice day, but something just felt kind of off. Everybody in the group actually remarks about a weird feeling, which is odd, but my dad laughs it off. My mum had goosebumps and keeps checking over her shoulder, which makes me on edge too. She is very insistent that it was weird and that she wants to leave, saying she feels like somebody's there. After a bit of hiking, I noticed a small red building. I've seen a bigger storage shed before, but it looks very well built. My uncle said that there was nothing about it on the listing, and we go and peek inside. The door was open, and inside are open cans of food, a blanket on the floor, and it smells foul. Following this discovery, We all agreed it would be best to go back to the car if there was some crazy hermit living in the woods who didn't want us to be around him. Only issue? We had walked pretty far into the woods and now weren't exactly sure what direction was correct. The eerie feeling really amped up and we're all on edge. We ended up trekking another mile before we finally found the road, but we were further down from where we had parked in the car, but at least we could just follow the road now. Walking along the road, we come across a truly unsettling sight. Right in the middle of the road in the asphalt is an animal on fire. I have no idea why it was there or why in the middle of the road or why it happened then, but it had to have been recently done. Naturally, we ran the rest of the way to the car. There was a huge scratch in the paint along all sides of it. Thankfully, the damage wasn't too bad. Now, eventually we were able to drive away as quick as possible. Needless to say, my uncle didn't buy the land, and I'll always remember the terrifying encounter. But like anything over time, it gets pushed to the back of my mind like a distant memory. The only reason I'm sharing it is I was reminded of something similar the other day. I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by woods, and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down the trail. This trail curved through the marsh into a big patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall/springtime, after heavy rains, a fog would often settle over the marsh as it was much lower than the surrounding area, and it truly looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. Now, after one of these rains, my brother and I, he was 13 and I was 16 I think, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we would make it to the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would be dark by the time that we got home and headed for the trail. Once on the trail and moving, it hit us how thick the fog actually was. We'd only been walking for a minute or two, but had absolutely no visibility between us and about 5 or 10 feet max in front. We continued walking for a few minutes just talking, but start hearing noises and seeing red eyes in the distance the whole time. We're not sure if they're animals or what. We eventually come to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we're about 100 yards back from the entrance of the woods. Now at this point, there's a small lake on the left side of the trail with the marshland. Now, it's important to note that we'd moved further and further away from the houses. Our house was the closest to the trail, and the trail moved away from our neighborhood rather than bordering any backwoods. Now, we begin walking past the lake and then hear a splash. Definitely much larger than a fish. I have no idea what made the sound, but we stopped and wait and hear nothing on the rest of the journey. We couldn't have been going for another 15 seconds though, before we hear crackling and shuffling in a brush up ahead to our left. We stop dead in our tracks and wait, and at the end of our eyesight, we can only have been about 10 feet away when a figure steps out from the bush bordering the lake. The fog was too thick to make out details, but they must have been at least 6'5" and very broad-shouldered. As the figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and it stopped. Its head shot over and looked right at us and just stared. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. It felt like a moment of pure terror that I've never felt before. I begin to take a small step backwards, and suddenly the figure takes off running into the marshland. Again, there are no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction it ran. Sufficient to say my brother and I sprinted back to the house faster than I ever ran before. Safe to say that I don't know what that was, and I hope I never have to find out. Now I posted this elsewhere a while back, But in the spirit of keeping this really new thing alive, I want to share my story here. Now, I was camping with my family at a provincial park in Newfoundland, Canada, mid-1980s. In Newfoundland, there's a lot of traditional folklore about fairy tales and being fairy-led, i.e. being sort of mesmerized and stolen away by the fairies. And although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I've heard those tales, I can't stop thinking about this experience. We arrived at the campground at around mid-afternoon. I remembered it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents are sitting up, my older sister, and ask if she wants to go check out the little beach area, which was a shortish walk along a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mum said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we're out of sight at the campground, things start to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the path all around us. Ferns are not usually found in Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before, bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large. Some were as tall as I am. Now I just cannot shake the feeling that there's people behind them or something watching me by. Although it was a very lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walk. A low-flying fog rolled in as we descend, first intendrous close to the ground, then gradually rising around us the lower we go towards the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I'd never walked into a fog like this before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I'm trying to ignore. Finally, we arrive at a steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerge onto a small foggy beach. With the woods behind us, it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise besides me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention, although I thought we were alone. I now noticed that there was a man several meters away standing very still and gazingly silent over the water. My sister called out a friendly hello, but he didn't move or appear to hear. After a minute or two, I start to feel nervous, so I talked to my sister about heading back to the campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing that I knew, we're walking on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seems like no time has passed. But I was tired, and my legs felt like I'd been walking for a long time, much longer than what I actually had. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which is strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disorientated and had no idea where we were, and I start to panic a bit, thinking we're lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she's pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off down the road in one direction that she suggested, and walked for about 45 minutes or so until we finally emerged at the campground, not far from the campsite. It was almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find out that our dad was there worried where we'd been. Although we'd thought we'd been gone for less than an hour, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mum had headed to the beach to look for us while he stayed at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness is setting in, and our dad was worried that our mum might not have returned, as he prepared to look for her. She burst in the doors, frantically saying that she'd run up and down them multiple times not finding us. She's amazed when she saw us. The only way to access that beach, aside from cutting through the woods, was to take the trail, and we hadn't passed her. Once we all calmed down and had dinner, I lay in my bunk. I remembered hearing my mum quietly telling my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we'd planned to stay longer, we actually pick up our things early and leave much earlier than we're supposed to. When I was a junior in college, I went camping with 4 of our friends in Bald Eagle State Park in PA. We reserved a campsite that was pretty remote, pretty deep in the park, one way up the mountain. Now, not near any of the other campsites that is. It was located at the end of a narrow dirt road which is maybe 75 feet long, which itself broke off from the main road, which I think was also dirt. There was nothing at the end of the little road but our campsite. We parked at the entrance of the park and spent the day hiking up the site. Setting up camp, and then hiking around, we made a fire, made dinner and turned in. Not long afterwards, we discovered that one of the guys with us snored loudly, like shaking the walls of the tent loud. Truly deafening. After probably an hour or so, the rest of us gave up on trying to get some sleep and climbed into our tents, leaving our one friend snoring away. Now, my friend at the time was a DJ for our school's radio station, so she had a late night show. I think she was on between midnight and 2 AM. Since we couldn't sleep, we trekked up the main road where reception was better and would actually be able to hear her radio over the snores. Now, when we got to the road, we stood in a loose circle near the entrance of our site. As we stood there, a black pickup truck with its lights off appeared out of the woods and passes us, very slowly. It's not marked. It's not a ranger. Now, we listened to the radio for maybe half an hour to 45 minutes after that, and even briefly call in to say hi. Finally, we decided to head back to bed. One of the girls went off into the woods to take care of some things when I climbed into the tent I shared with her and got into my bag. A couple of minutes after, I heard the movement of leaves towards the tent coming from my right. At the same time, I also heard the unmistakable rumble of tires on the ground. I stood up and looked out of the little screen window in the tent. We hadn't bothered to put up the rain fly, as it was a perfectly clear night with a very bright moon, so I couldn't see everything. I saw my friend coming back to the tent, ducking behind it as the black truck pulls into our campsite. Now, it actually still has its headlights off and then shuts off its engine and sits there. Our friend is still snoring. I have a little knife in my tent, and I know my other 2 friends have at least one in theirs. But we have no other weapon, no guns or bear spray, so we just watch. As I said, it was a clear night. I see my truck is just fine. It's maybe 20 feet from the tent, but I can't see who's in the truck or how many people are there. Nothing seems to be moving inside the truck. I still remember the metallic clunk sounds as the engine cools off. Now, I've really got no idea how long we just watched it. My friend had ducked down behind our tent, and I could hear her breathing and that she was terrified. Neither of us said a word. It feels like a really long time that goes by, probably 10 minutes at the very least, maybe more. We just keep waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and eventually the truck starts up again and then back down the long narrow dirt road. It never turned its headlights on. I heard it drive back in the direction that it originally come from, and that was it. My friend burst into the tent a second later saying, "God, did you see that?" And our best friend there was still asleep. Eventually we went to bed and packed up and headed out in the morning as planned. Now, a group of friends and I decided to rent a place on a lake, just for fun. Now, we're all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be a big party, and for the most part that's exactly what it was. The Friday night and Saturday morning was pretty much us having a blast there on the water, just doing stupid things. Well, naturally, when Saturday rolled around, we were all so dead from going out that we decided it would be a night of no drinking. and just kind of a chill evening. And that's what it was, relaxed. So 9 p.m. comes rolling around, and about 8 of us are inside the house and 5 outside. The house has a 2-story with a 2nd-story deck/back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods you hit a lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town, mostly just backward old timers that I assumed were leering and irritated because we're a bunch of college kids just having a good time. But the town and lake was so large that it's not like anybody I knew would have been there, and I didn't know anybody was staying there. Anyway, 3 of us are up on the back porch, and my other friend and I are going downstairs outside, just talking, going towards the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friends and I just got lost in our conversation when all of a sudden I get a feeling that something's off. It's kind of like a very unnerving physical experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong we both had quieted down a bit, and then, out of nowhere, this loud chanting erupts from the woods. I had no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake's set up. I'm pretty sure the voices carried up through the forest. It sounded like a cult chanting away. All of them are male voices. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we all froze for about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself and dart towards the house with her following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling with the chanting, but it was almost like evil. Just like something really powerful was happening. I was shaking by the time that we got up to the 2nd story and ran out to the balcony with the other 3 friends. One of them my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and naturally I asked, "Did you guys hear that?" in the most shaky and freaked out voice. They all had heard it, but not the second later chanting. Now, the 5 of us out there were peering into the forest, listening to the chanting that would sometimes sound very far away and then relatively close. All of them are male voices in the weirdest language that I don't even know. It kind of sounded like a part of some weird extreme cult or church. Then following the chanting was a loud bang like somebody hitting a metal object which is huge. And then the worst came, a man wailing like in extreme pain. All of my hair was up. It was the scariest experience ever. My brother and I were staring at each other in a mixture of scared excitement and horror. The wailing stopped, and then it was back to chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it that I wanted to call the cops, cause whoever screamed had been in a lot of pain. That mixed with the weird chanting just made me immediately think of some kind of terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say it was some drunk guys messing around and singing and being weird, but there's no way that was the sound coming from them. They were perfectly in sync, and the wail of pain is really like nothing that I've ever heard before. It was just off and really messed up. Now definitely, whatever that sound was, it seemed to know that we were there. Now after a while it eventually fades out, and after that I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the feeling of relief when we were driving away the next morning. Even now, just thinking of this gives me a horrible feeling. Now to start off, I'd like to say that I'm an avid RVer, and I've travelled along coast to coast in the USA with my family and children, and the dog, an Australian Shepherd. We have been deep in the woods and heard strange noises, stayed in cities riddled with crime, and I've never felt out of control or uneasy until White Cities, NM. If you're unfamiliar with the area, there is almost nothing but desert in the surrounding areas. Roswell, NM is only about 1.5 miles north of White Cities. The area has many boogeymen in the surrounding folklore, things from skinwalkers, kidnappers, aliens and more. White City, which sits just outside of the entrance to the Carlsbad Caverns, has a population of 85 according to a quick Google search. At first, upon setting up camp, things felt off for lack of a better word, but nothing happened to a point as for a reason why. I kept my mouth shut as to not speak or spook my wife or kids for no reason, but the entire time it felt as though we were being watched. Every turn I made had almost something ominous looming, only to find nothing, until I walked my dog later that night. My dog, a 2-year-old Australian Shepherd, is very friendly and aloof, up to the point that he had never shown any signs of aggression and only exhibited sweet behaviours. Now it had just gotten dark, and due to a long day of travelling, he needed to take a walk bad. At new places, I always kept him leashed. As we were starting around an abandoned city, I thought I saw a shadow figure moving next to the restaurant building across the street. I focused my vision, but nothing. Weird. Keep walking. Then out of nowhere, my dog jumped to attention and started ferociously barking and growling into the dark shadow near where I saw the movement. I had never heard anything close to that coming from him before or since, but there was nothing there, yet, still, he was frothing and really snarling and growling. I dragged the dog back to the camper, but I still kept quiet about it. I decided to shrug it off. I kept a close eye on the family that night. We left the next day, and my wife remarked, "So glad that we're leaving this place, it gives me the heebie-jeebies." I said why, and she said, "I dunno, just creepy here." So I looked up reviews of the campsite, and another camper said that they felt the same way as us, and that upon returning to his camp spot after a long day out, he saw a dozen cloaked and hooded people holding up candles doing some weird ritual near the site. I then took a deep dive on the internet and couldn't find anything else with regards to White City, but there was an old stone castle type structure on the hill above the campsite. I intended to go back to check it out, but I got spooked out after what happened with the dog and the other review that I read. So I don't know exactly who or what is lurking out there, but it's definitely creepy. Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. Sorry if my voice was a little bit different in the last 2 videos. Whatever throat problem I had a month ago seems to have come back again. I have got it checked out by a doctor and they think it was a recurring virus or something, but luckily this time it wasn't as bad as before. And for whatever reason when I had it this time it coincided with mouth ulcers, which I think was just bad timing, because to be honest I was eating lots of junk food around the time. But luckily my voice has come back so I can actually record again and not have to feel uncomfortable when doing so. So I've really enjoyed doing these stories. So I hope you all really enjoyed these stories, and make sure you check out my Patreon if you want early access to my stories, which is in the description. And make sure you check out my podcast, which is also in the description, where you can hear all of my videos posted there too. I have a quick message before the video starts too. And for today I'd like to share that even if things are going bad in your life and not exactly how you want, or even going all against you, it's up to you to make a decision and decide that you're going to be greater than it and overcome all of it. Having that kind of mindset and choosing strength is something that can actually go a very long way. And I think even some people that haven't tried it before might be really surprised by the strength that they have within. I think everybody has that and doesn't necessarily realize it. So make sure that if things are going bad, don't judge it too much. Just accept that it's a rough time and choose to have the strong mindset and to overcome it. Brighter days will come, you just have to keep putting in the effort and you will overcome it, and I believe in you. So I hope you're all doing great and enjoyed these stories. I'll speak to you all soon. One of the weirdest experiences I had was during the start of my career. In fact, it was so early as being a ranger, literally my first day, that I didn't think much of it. I thought, well, it's probably just my mind just running around because I'm new to this thing. Basically, I had to go and investigate a backpack somebody left there. Nothing too bad. It was just somewhere that it really shouldn't have been, and we needed to make sure it wasn't anything bad. As I approach, I get this weird warm feeling which comes across my body. I look up, and there's kind of a distortion near a tree. It's really hard to focus on it, and I actually have to move forward a bit to make out the silhouette of this. I'm completely perplexed as to what this could possibly be, and I have to walk closer to figure out what it is, and I can't. What's really weird is that I hear breathing now, very faintly but coming from near the tree. I think maybe this is some kind of really advanced thing that maybe somebody's got out here, like some hunting thing or God knows what. It's kind of like a cloak. I get to probably 3 inches away and I can make out this thing is very tall. I raise my hand up to touch where it is, and that's when I see what are very clearly teeth. They're kind of like a black metallic colour. It blends in with the tree really well from where I'm standing, and I can hear the breathing more now. What's really weird is something drips onto my hand and it does actually become wet. I quickly wipe it off and look down at my hand, look up, and this thing is gone. I knew something was definitely there because I was a bit wet now, and I think, wow, this is the kind of thing that happens when you start this job. Thinking that maybe you just have to watch your mind in the forest, I decided to go and check out the backpack, thinking that I'm very paranoid of it and I'm just imagining things. But however, the more the times went on, the more and more weird I think this whole thing was, and that I kind of wish it happened later in my career because I wouldn't have been so quick to dismiss it. One of the weirdest stories I've ever heard happened is not my own, but my father's. My father works as a Forest Service worker, and he had many weird encounters over his years. This one in particular gave me chills all throughout my childhood, and it made me constantly just question things. Now, I'll tell this exactly how my father's told me and how that he's wrote it down for me, so sit back and enjoy. I think it's truly bizarre. Now, to start out, everything's going pretty well in life. I'm happy and my wife is now pregnant. Now this is going to be our second child. We already had our other one who's about 1 now, and we're really excited to have a second. We had a boy and we were hoping for another girl. It turned out that we had another boy, but that was just as much joy into our lives. Those who haven't experienced parenthood don't understand how it changes your life sometimes, and how it changes your approach to taking risks. I know that I certainly had the same feeling too. Now, where I was based at for my job, I didn't really encounter anything too heavy. I hadn't been working this role for that many years, and there was other more experienced guys out there. In fact, a lot of the time I'd actually get quite frustrated because I really truly wanted to do more, but I just wasn't able to. Sometimes there would be things that the other guys would know that I could do, and they would just rush off to do it before I had the chance to, and it was so frustrating. I enjoyed being out there, don't get me wrong, but I was kind of stuck doing more computer stuff and just, I guess, the boring things. Now, at this place, I knew that I could progress, but it was going to take years. They basically offered me all the training and everything, but my god, it was slow. The thing was, I was probably smarter than all of the people there, just not being given any opportunities that I needed to progress. It was almost like they'd given me this form, and it said everything I needed to do, but there were holes in it that they couldn't see, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. I was quite tempted to join the Navy. I actually wanted to become a Navy SEAL at the time. It wasn't really possible because of some of the injuries I had, but I know that if I really pushed myself, I probably could have overcome them. But the problem was, even sometimes when I was doing this job, even just hiking around and doing my normal things, I would have a pain that I couldn't seem to stop from the bottom of my foot. I actually still have issues with it today. I'm not quite sure why it started, but yeah, it's just something I get on with. So on this particular day, it was just the same. There was more exciting call-outs and things to go and do, but literally before I could even get to the radio to say I would do it, someone would say I'm on it and would already be up there with their coffee in their hand, taking the last sips of their coffee before flying on out the door and to go and have all the fun. Yeah, it kind of really sucked doing this, but I guess it gave me more time to think and just relax a bit. The problem is, if you're like me, that time very quickly lends to boredom. I started going through some of the records and some of the reports. I basically had to reorganize them because some people in this office area, they would just throw everything onto a desk and not do anything. They would only look for items if they needed it, which of course is a very stupid idea and wastes everyone's time, but back in my day, I guess that's how it was. So I start reading through some reports. There was a few pretty creepy things on there. Some people would say that they had a feeling, like an intense feeling of fear that they couldn't describe, accompanied by a knocking on some of the trees. They were never able to locate the source of this sound and they thought it was just animals, but it came up quite often over the years. Then I heard a really strange one. Apparently, there was a ranger that worked here, and a lot of the other people thought that he was going crazy. I was reading a second-hand account of what had happened to him. Apparently, something had spoke to him and told him the future. Weirdly though, when I looked back through another account, which was more recent than that one, some of the things that he said actually come true. And the person making the report actually noted that and how weird it was. Upon further investigation, it turned out that this person thought that he had spoke to beings or something. I don't know, kind of like aliens? They didn't describe it very well, just very vaguely. Now it seems like many of these cases were dismissed. There were other weird things too, like a Pacific area where you'd feel very hot. Completely unnaturally, to the point that you'd actually question if there was some kind of hot spring there. Or something weird that shouldn't have been there. But again, they could never find the source of it. The thing that made this even more bizarre is that eventually the plants and trees and everything in the area would start to die, so you basically knew for certain that something was definitely off there. Now I decided that I had to get out and do the very minimum just to not be in the office, and that's what I did. I remembered setting out and I was being a little bit more paranoid than normal. I think all these stories were just playing in my head. I remembered I kept thinking that I saw something walking through the tree line above, ahead of me, always maintaining the higher ground. It kind of just trailed alongside me. It's really hard to describe, but was truly creepy. Now I don't know what it was, but I think it was some kind of large animal there. Not big enough to be a bear, but certainly weird. I did think maybe it was a hiker out there, but it wasn't possible. I thought that was bizarre. I remember thinking to myself that you've just learnt the power of human potential in the mind, and it was pretty scary to me. Now, life goes on. We probably get to about a month or 6 weeks in, and again, they're just not training me properly. It's kind of really annoying because they'll complain at me for doing something when it's exactly how somebody's told me to do it. And they'll say, oh no, just do it confidently. But then they'll say, why did you do that? And you'll explain that's how you're trained, and they wouldn't seem to listen, and it was kind of like a hostile group. I didn't end up staying there for too long, but I'll get to that later. So what do? Once again, get reserved to balancing the books and just doing the normal work. Now this is actually at a time before we had computers, so it did make days very boring too. The problem I found is that some people just did not have good handwriting. I've never been the best at reading others' handwriting, but especially in these situations, my god, it was like some of these people had honestly made an effort to write as illegible as possible. And again, if you can't read it, they complain, so I kind of become an expert of reading these things eventually. And again, every so often there's weird reports. I realise too, quite often when it's recorded, people just think, oh, it's the other guy not paying attention. Maybe he wants everyone to look at him and stuff like that. At least that's on the report conclusion, but I had a feeling that something was off when I kept on seeing the reportings of some kind of beings out there. This spanned over a number of years too, and long before I was there. They all seemed to be described as relatively the same. They called them the forest walkers. Apparently they seemed to be quite tall, and they would walk in almost a weird limp motion. The weird thing is that they would be silent too, and if you approached them, weird things would happen. Some people said they felt almost like they were high. Others said that they would just know things they couldn't have otherwise and stuff like that. I don't know if I believe in the supernatural that much, or at least at the time I didn't, but I just considered that these were just things that happen when you've been out in the woods for too long by yourself. Now eventually as time increased, and I started complaining to the higher ups about the issues I was having, I started to get out more and do more interesting things. I even got to rescue a few people too, which is a really cool feeling. I don't know if you've ever experienced it before, but there's something so cool about knowing that you preserved human life. You stepped in and you made a big difference and impact for someone. It's not something I'd felt before in other jobs too, so I was quite happy. Now, as I go out for a patrol one evening, I remembered having a strange feeling that the air was different. There was almost some kind of metallic smell that I couldn't quite describe. I was concerned that I had some kind of illness or that I accidentally got something on my nose, but no matter how much I wipe my nose, I can't seem to get rid of the feeling. And there was almost some kind of static in the air. You know, like when you have static electric and just before you feel the buzz, it was kind of like that. Now that's when I feel something. I can tell something's looking at me and I stop to turn around and see what it is. And then I can make out some kind of figure. It's probably about 20 feet away. It's wearing kind of like a dark coloured robe, but when it gets closer it appears more white. It walks with a weird limp and I can't believe my eyes. I actually rub my eyes quickly, not sure for a second if I'm dreaming, and it's gone. Now I think this is pretty creepy. I want to figure out what this is, so filled with excitement I actually jogged towards where it was. Now I couldn't tell you too much else about it, but just that it completely vanished. I probably spent another hour myself actually searching the surrounding areas, just to see if I could find something, anything there to explain what I'd just seen, but alas, I come up blank. There's nothing there but myself. Now I'm actually a little bit irritated because I don't want to seem stupid. I really don't want to become like one of the people whose stories I've read, probably to be dismissed later on the same way that I dismissed some of theirs. But currently, it seems like I'm going to have no option but for that to be the case for myself. Yeah, it sucked really. I go back eventually and tell them what happened. Now, no one believes me, which is what I expected, and they say, yeah, you're too junior to be going out there and investigating things like this. I was pretty fed up again. I come from a role before where I was very well respected, and honestly the way I was being treated was really annoying me. Now a few months go on, and it becomes winter, and the going gets a little bit more tough really. It was pretty cold out there. I mean, uncomfortably so for myself. Now, I remembered on one particular day, I can't tell you specifically what I was doing, I just remembered that I was out there, that I spotted something weird. I mean really bizarre. There were these small figures, kind of limping around in the woods, again silently. Now I can't believe what I'm seeing. They're probably about 5 feet tall now, and in more of a white coloured gown kind of thing. Like I said, I didn't know what this was. I thought maybe it was something from Halloween, like decorations people put out there. And I actually wasn't too scared now. I was convinced that this wasn't actually a real thing or threat or danger, so I decided to sit back and very slowly follow these things. Now I didn't look behind myself, so there could have been more, but these things just kept on marching on, kind of down the path for a good 10 minutes longer. Now they never once seemed to notice me or so much as turn around, so again, I'm still not entirely sure what I'm seeing, but I think it's some kind of Halloween decoration that someone's playing around with. I don't know, it could be a cult, it could be anything, but I'm not too worried. I don't know if it was the size of them or what, but I just wasn't concerned. Also, there seemed to be nature interacting normally around, so that meant that these things weren't a threat, at least I thought. So this continues on until eventually they all stop at something. I stopped too, and I can see about 4 of them. I was incredibly curious as to what they were looking at, but there's no real way for me to be able to see where I'm based currently. I get closer and closer and realize that I'm going to have to take the long way round now to figure out what it is. I decide to take a stealthy approach, and I try and walk very slowly through the foliage and get around. I do make it to a pretty good horizon, and I can see in front, and I still can't figure out what they're looking at. Now I'm sure these are people now, so I become a little bit more confident, and I walk down even closer to where they are. Eventually, I ended up crashing through some of the brush, and I decide that I'm going to be more present now. Obviously these people know that I'm here, so what's the point of trying to hide away from them? I go a little bit quicker now, and eventually go round to where I think that they're facing, and I can't see their actual faces. It's kind of just dark where that their faces are completely covered up in something. Now, I crouch down to get a better look at them, and suddenly, I can hear voices in my head. They don't sound like voices I ever heard before too, and it's almost like my own voice but different. And I keep hearing different things that haven't happened yet. I hear about the birth of my son and know that it's going to be a boy. I know exactly what he's going to look like, how my career's going to go, what my wife's going to do, and some of the hardships that come up and who's going to pass away in my family. It actually makes me incredibly emotional at this point, and I almost feel like it's too much and start to cry a bit. I ended up kind of just becoming overwhelmed with my emotions, and I fall back into the dirt and stare up at the sky. The sky's very bright today, and it actually looks quite nice. After a moment, I kind of stop hearing the voices so much. They kind of just slowly fade out, like somebody slowly turning down the volume on a record, and I get up. I realise now that whatever these things are has gone now, and I'm just here alone, very confused as to what's actually just happened to me. I get up, and I'm sure there's going to be an explanation for this. I ended up scouring around for probably another hour and a half until I conclude that nothing's here. That's when my panic finally catches up with me, and I decide that I need to get back as quick as possible. I start making my way there. I eventually get back to the station and immediately write down my report. I didn't speak to anybody else about what had happened, and that's when I'm confused. I suddenly realised that what I was reading was very similar to some of the reports of what had happened years before. The ones where that people had considered the guys that were reporting it a little bit crazy or seeing things. And for that reason, I actually took the report and ended up throwing it into the trash. I didn't want my colleagues to think I was crazy. I mean, I didn't like most of them to begin with. I knew that this was going to hurt me moving on to the other areas that I wanted to work, so there was going to be no benefit of me actually posting this. And I ended up moving on and working as a ranger in different areas and doing different kinds of roles too, even being a fire service worker. Now here's the weird thing. I only realised it much later, but I did have a son, and he looked exactly like I knew he would. The job that I changed into is exactly what I heard I would. My wife's role too. Also, some family members that died, they were the exact people who I was told would do so as well. Now suddenly I felt kind of a weird fear come over me, almost like a wash and flood of emotions coming back, realising that something had contacted me back then, and for whatever reason wanted me to know what was going to happen. I can't put my finger on why this happened or how it happened to me. I just know what I saw was real, and that I wasn't the only person that saw those kinds of things out there. Lots of my other colleagues had experienced some very similar things, and I just don't know what to make of it all. So I live in Austin, Texas. We have a metropolitan park located in North Austin that's almost 300 acres. I visit this park often and have never had a weird experience until now. This park has a ton of trails for mountain bikes and hiking. There are also other areas that have creeks which run through the park. Now 2 days ago, I took my 4 kids and myself on the trail hiking. We arrived at the trailhead around 4 PM and started our hike. There are 3 bridges over water that we passed during the hike. Each bridge was at least half a mile apart. Our destination required us to pass along all 3 bridges before we started to make our way back. We made it to our destination. As we start walking back, we don't have any issues, only the occasional mountain biker who passes us by. On the way back, as we walk over the second bridge, my kids and I, now they're all under the age of 10, heard someone very clearly in a female voice say, "Hi dear, come over here," twice, from under the bridge. The first time we heard it, we all stop in our tracks and look at each other like, "Did you hear that?" My 9-year-old daughter even asked me, "Mum, what was that? Did you hear this?" And my 3-year-old appears very perplexed. There was no one in sight. I even look under the bridge and I can't see anybody there. I can hear rustling though, and then I hear it again, identical in tone and pitch and duration. "Hi dear, come over here," almost robotic. This was about an hour or so into the hike, around 5 PM. At that point, we all started swiftly walking towards the trailhead. No one said a word the whole time. I remained calm, as I always carry my side piece, so I had a form of self-defense to rely on, but still, it definitely spooked us out. Now there's a playground not far from the trailhead. I ask my kids if they want to play on the playground and they all say no without missing a beat, and we go straight back. I still have no idea what it was. It sounded just like a recording, but it wasn't. For a little bit of background about myself, I've worked my entire adult life in the Pacific Northwest woods. That's over 15 years in total, and about 7 of them being at the Park Service at the Olympic National Park. Many experiences over the years could warrant the title of creepy, but this one particular one truly sticks with me. While working for the Park Service, one of my jobs was to be a restoration carpenter. We would travel to old backwoods historical cabins, emergency shelters and homesteads, and other things, tasked with repairing and restoring them to their original historical accurate states. Now this is truly a wonderful yet demanding job. I'd spend 8 days at a time living off the beaten path, usually deep in the backcountry. Sometimes we'd been flown in supplies, sometimes we'd use llamas or mules to pack our gear, all the while sleeping in a thinly walled single tent, cooking over a fire or whisper-lit stove, using the same tools and techniques of the original homesteaders that they had at their disposals in the 1800s to construct and survive in this unforgiving land. One night, in late fall, I was assigned to work near Lake Ozette at the old homestead off the trail. Near the constructed boardwalk, for those unfamiliar with the area, Lake Ozette is 8 miles long and 3 wide. It sits as the largest unaltered natural lake in Washington. Lake Ozette has a long and rich history of Native American culture. The Maca Tribal Center in Neah Bay houses discoveries found in the area dating back to 2,000 years ago, along with a local village that is well preserved over 300 years ago by a mudslide that left most of the artifacts there intact. Now the Ozette Loop Trail, which the homestead was directly adjacent to, is approximately 9.4 miles through and through. The man-made boardwalk takes you under giant cedar groves. meanders through giant patches of chest-high saleal before eventually delivering you to Alströmer's Prairie, about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. Now, this Alströmer's Prairie is a giant soggy meadow which was once farmed by two Swedish immigrants. They constructed a small cabin and some outbuildings on the 150-acre bog, with cattle, sheep, vegetable gardens, and help of a little Swedish ingenuity. They're actually able to live out here for over 50 years. Over time, the forest, as it always does, decided to take back which was once its own. The now decades-long abandoned farm was hardly recognizable. Our job was to get it back and encroach the forest, put new windows into the main cabin, pipe in a new stove, apply fresh paint, and just generally fix up portions of it. Now, the ultimate goal being guided tours to take place in the future sometime. For about 3 weeks we stayed at the bunkhouse while working at the Astrums. This was good duty for us. We weren't sleeping under rain, our beds were warm, our hike was short, and the train wasn't difficult. We even had TV. The bunkhouse was located near the highway and ranger station. We would hike the 5-mile loop every day, bringing with us our boards, tools, and paint, and everything else we needed. Now, these were 10+ hour days, and we usually started in the morning at around 7 hiking and returning at around 5. Now, at one point during the fall, there were 4 of us working this project, but at the time of this event, there was only 2 of us remaining. Most of the hard work had been finished now, and we decided to hike a few last boards into the prairie to complete a portion of the wood wash before we called it done. I volunteered to go back and bring everything. Now, my only job being to carry as many boards as I could muster in each trip before returning to the ranger station to load the next time. It was late in the season for hikes at this point. The weather had turned, and we'd be lucky to see 2 or 3 people a day doing the loop. Around my 4th and final trip, it was pretty tiring. I was getting really tired of it, and it's late now. At around 4, myself and my co-worker called it a day. I thought I could get one more trip in before it gets dark, my rationale being that the more trips I did today, the less I would have to do tomorrow. We ended up pushing on and continue and start our hike back to the ranger station. The lighting on the boardwalk was quite low at this point, and the cedars blocking most of the ambient light left by the setting sun and making visibility quite diminished. Now, I'm not a nervous hiker, and I don't really get scared easily at all. Having solo hiked for weeks on end in the backcountry, I've been stalked by cougars, confronted by Klondike bears in Alaska. I've even ran into a few demented hillbillies over the years. As I left the prairie that evening, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, goosebumps erupt on my forearms, and an uneasy feeling sweeps over me. Suddenly I walk faster, and then sprint. I did, and I didn't have to think about it, and I try and convince myself that I've been reading too many stories. I walked another 5 minutes or so before I start hearing something faint, sounding just like music. Impossible, I tell myself. I'm so far from civilization. It can't actually be what's out there. But sure enough, I hear music, and specifically a piano. It started out so faint that I stopped moving and actually try and hear it. The steps on the wooden boardwalk are so loud, but every time I stop, it becomes louder. Now I stood there, sun now fully hidden behind the horizon, in total silence other than the piano. I became aware that there were no longer sounds of life, no birds, no insects, no wind, no rustling of leaves or underbrush. Absolutely silent, yet the piano is present, as if everything was being weighed down by a fog of emptiness of sorts. I've encountered this dead before in the woods, but never quite like this. I tried to keep focus on the keys, but I can't recognize the composition. Not really surprisingly though, because I usually listen to Metallica. Now, It was playing with a purpose and controlled in tune, thoughtful. It was a song, and somehow I felt that it was meant for just me in this moment. I start walking again slowly, almost on cue for the music, but it once again gets louder as my pace increased. So did the tempo of the keys, still in tune, never faltering. It reached a climax, a perfect combination of my haste, dread, heartbeat, and God knows what else. Now, it then quickly whooshed away as quickly as it come, not trailing off or fading, just gone, and suddenly everything was back how it was with a gust of wind. The stillness was gone, the gloom and creepiness had left. My next step on the boardwalk went pretty much normally, and it was almost like it never happened. Now, I didn't hear the piano again that night, nor since. I told my co-worker every detail when I reached the bunkhouse. He showed no signs of disbelief. We didn't talk about it again until years later when something similar happened to another park employee, another ranger. When I told my grandfather about what happened, who was a retired state park ranger, he said, "Oh, the piano again?" And apparently he'd hear bagpipes when he heard it when he was younger. Now this didn't directly happen to me, but I live in the area where it happened. Now me and my friends were discussing scary things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. So this guy with 5 of his friends was spending a day in a cabin, hunting and trapping. They were not drunk but had a few beers to unwind one night. So one of them goes to the outhouse and to the bathroom and swears that he can hear the sound of a drum beating. So he finishes off in the outhouse and goes into the cabin and tells his friends to come back and check out the sound. So they all grab their rifles and walk out of the ridge from their cabin and down to the hollow and behind it and then back up to the other side. It's actually quite a rocky area, and the sound actually travels really far, and they can tell that the sound's coming from over the hill. So 5 of them spread out about 50 meters apart and walk up over the top. They couldn't see down over there because of the bushes around, so the 5 of them wait there, and one of them sneaks down to see what it was. When he got there, he stood and watched for 30 seconds to a minute before he turned around and went to his friends as fast as he could, telling them he saw evil and that they had to get out of there. All he would tell them is that he saw a bunch of naked men and women dancing around a circle, chanting in some foreign language. He never told them about everything he saw. The guy told my friend this story, actually hung back and didn't go down, so he wasn't sure exactly what this person had seen himself. When I was about 5 years old, I was playing by the edge of the woods behind my grandmother's house. I played there often, and my grandmother kept an eye on me from the kitchen or living room because the house had huge windows that faced the woods. She would come out every once in a while just to see what I was getting up to. I was obsessed with digging in the dirt and collecting unusual rocks and arrowheads that littered the land where my grandmother lived. I should mention that this is in the Midwest Illinois, not far from the Cherokee Mounds, so finding arrowheads was not actually that uncommon. Anyway, that day, I still remembered picking out a spot to dig. I had been out there for quite a while because I remembered I had dug a pretty good sized hole. Then something caught my eye up in the tree that I was next to. I almost don't know how to explain it, but it looked like a heat wave coming off the branch of the tree. It was fall. I remembered because I had my pink jacket on, and remembered thinking that my mum was going to be annoyed because I had dirt around the bottom of my arms from digging. I also remembered there being a lot of leaves on the ground. Anyway, I am staring at this heat wave and realise that it was human shape. So here I am, 5 years old, wondering why that there's an invisible man in the tree. I remembered feeling scared but unsure what to do. Then, It started moving and making a faint clicking sound. This is about the time that I decided that I was not supposed to be seeing this, and I hightailed it back to my house. My grandmother saw that I was pretty shaken, and I remember telling her that this is what's happened, and thinking that it was an angel. Now in my 5-year-old mind, I don't know what else it could have been. I never heard of aliens or ghosts or monsters, so to me, it had to be an angel because that's all my little brain can think of. Fast forward to when I'm about 12 years old. By the time this encounter happened, it was way out of my mind. I love watching action and sci-fi movies. My dad rented a movie called Predator. I am watching it with him. And the first time you see the Predator/invisible cloaking, I'm petrified. All the memories from that day digging in the dirt came flooding back to me. I asked my dad if the Predator's real or if there's any animal that had that kind of ability that I wasn't sure of. He said no, it's all fake. It wasn't like it was today where you can just Google it. I had no access to the internet, so again, I put it out of mind. Now fast forward to about the year 2004. I'm grown, have 3 small children. I just went through a separation. Now I moved to the next town over to an apartment with my children. These apartments are all 1-level duplexes where there are 5 buildings. I am at the very last apartment of the last building. The apartments are considered in town but are really on the outskirts. There is a deep ditch that runs behind the building with a chain link fence that separates the backyard from the ditch. There are about 6 or 7 trees on our side of the fence. If you follow the ditch a little bit, you hit a small forest that eventually leads to a country with a larger forest and land. Now, I'm a smoker, but I wouldn't smoke in the apartment because of my children, so I often go out to the back porch to smoke. One night, I was up late doing laundry and stuff after the kids went to bed. I decided to take a smoke break before I myself went to sleep. I am back there on the porch and start hearing a clicking sound, and immediately looked to the ditch because I had seen a groundhog out there a few days before and thought perhaps he was out there again. The yard is fairly lit, but not too well actually, and there's a playground that is right to the end of my back porch. I didn't turn on my porch light. I didn't normally. If I was just going out there for a quick smoke, I wouldn't. Now, I didn't see any groundhog or movement from the ditch, so I go back to smoking my cigarette. The faint clicking sound keeps happening, and I see a slight shift of movement which actually shakes me up, which goes into the tree to the left of my porch. It's there. The same invisible thing that I had seen when I was 5. It's kind of distorted and has a humanoid shape. It is crouched down, or has a branch or something coming out from around the tree, which is wrapped onto it, or maybe it's holding the tree and I can't believe it. I was like, is this happening? Has this come to kill me from all those years ago? All I could think about was my kids in the apartment sleeping, so I ran in, slammed and locked the door. I ran to the kids' room and make sure that they're all locked. Then I just turn on the lights to the living room and stare out the blinds at the tree to see if I can catch another glimpse of it. I sat there for about a good 10 minutes and can't see anything. I begin to think that I'm just tired and that my mind was playing tricks on me. Just as I finally start talking myself to calm down, my neighbour's dog comes running across the backyard and starts barking at the tree at the same branch that I'd seen this predator thing, and it freaks me out because the dog was not a barker. I've actually never heard him barking at anything, even at the groundhog that had been out there hanging out in the ditch. The dog actually goes on barking now for quite a number of minutes until eventually the lady who owns it calls him back inside, and the dog reluctantly returns back home, stopping every few feet to look back at the branch. That's until he's out of my sight. I didn't sleep that night and have never seen anything like it again. I don't even know what to think of it. I'm a grown woman now. I have kids and a good career. I just can't make out what this could have possibly been. Now for context, I do believe in paranormal. I've had encounters and experiences as my mum and grandma This was a little different and not as scary, just weird. I was manager of a very well-known drugstore and took a back road to the store every day for about 2 years. Now, it was semi-rural, as it had once been acres of farmland that was now being developed and sold to developers. Just for some insight into the area, my ex-in-laws lived in the area for about 30 years on 200 acres and had a cattle farm. They still live nearby, just on a smaller farm, so this is a very frequented area to drive to by family, and my ex knew the area well. This was a heavily mained area, and there's a lot of strange things that happen here. There was also a huge landfill in the area. Now, I was coming home one day, July-ish, not too tired, and was looking across the cornfields as I come around a bend and noticed a house on the edge of the fields that I'd never seen before. It was very unassuming and red, with a small peak roof and a porch in front. My first thought was not, wow, I've never seen this before. It was instead, how do people get into it? There are no driveways leading there. Weird, in 2015 there had to be a driveway. As I continued and rounded a bend, I couldn't see the house anymore, but was looking a few houses over, and I also can't see driveways into them. There's also nobody there. Now, by this point, I come across a very well-travelled intersection in a huge church, so I just stay alert and keep driving. Later, I'm telling my ex about this house and how weird it felt, and all the time that I've driven there, I never noticed it. I went to work the next day, coming home the only way that I knew, and it wasn't there. None of it was there. I don't know what I saw that day, but I can see the house very clearly in my head. I seriously don't know what to make of this. Now, my wife and I have found a lot of paranormal activity after moving into a wooded area just outside of Pittsburgh. Our house is isolated from the neighborhood. That only makes the fear of something terrible happening worse. I would like to point out that me and my wife are logical, rational thinkers who are educated to some degree, not able to explain events or what happened. Now, incident 1 was first things that animals were dying in the wild, which is common, but hearing the screams and struggling of pain, almost like they're being tortured, is not normal. It sends chills down my spine. Second, walking in the woods accompanied by my wife and kids, we stumbled upon a small clearing in the woods, under the leaves where children's shoes are. Shoes are worn out as if they've been there for a long time. 3. This one's hard to believe, trust me, I know. I was in denial. I didn't tell my wife what I'd seen for weeks. Now, I didn't want to catch this thing after seeing what it was, but I was outside smoking a cigarette on the second floor. Now, while on my phone, I had a feeling that I'm being stared at. I glance away from my phone to look. In my peripheral vision, I catch a humanoid shape. I say peripheral because it was almost like I couldn't focus on it. It bolted into the woods behind my home, completely off guard and terrified. I didn't even watch it run into the woods. I looked straight ahead and acted like I never saw it, like a deer in headlights. I acted like scared prey. This creature wasn't human, and that's why I was terrified. It was tall, had shoulders and a head, no hair, and colour of skin that I can't make out. It's weird, it's like my brain couldn't process it well. As I said straight, completely frozen in fear, I'm hearing the strides of this thing. Now, I don't know what it was. Months go by and get to 4 now. Now, same bathroom window where I saw that. Now, we open the window to smoke, and it sounds like it's gonna pour down. Both of us are completely confused because no water's falling from the sky. I walk downstairs to go outside and try and understand what's going on. The garden hose is on, and the handle is pushed into the dirt, shooting water into a tree, making a weird sound. None of us put it there. Now, incident 5. We feel like we're being watched one night in the daytime, and the woods are normal and somewhat peaceful. We constantly have an eerie feeling though. Now 6. At this moment, we become interested and are sitting by our window every night trying to find explanations to what the humanoid thing is. We made conversation on a different subject when a loud crack came from the ground right below us. It was loud enough that both of us jumped and quickly locked the window. It sounded like a bat or axe hitting the ground really hard, but nothing should have been able to make that sound because of how the ground is. Now 7. As we were laying in my bed, my wife woke me up at 2 AM and said that she smells burning plastic and thought something's on fire. We have a 2-story house and had a bedroom window cracked, and we look outside to find the cause of the smell and saw a lit up triangular shaped thing in the back of the house deep in our woods. It was orange lights and blue lights and orbs that we can see, and shadows of people walking around the triangular thing. We were very scared and called the cops, but doubt set in and we checked the window again and this is gone. 8. After all of this, we still stay active. So we went on a walk one evening with the children around the neighborhood and just observed a really nice sunset basically. We head home and obviously this place is weird. We would want to walk outside and we decided to go to our gravel driveway, which is about 100 yards away. Trees on all sides, bushes and smaller trees below them. After about maybe 15 feet onto the driveway, we noticed bats flying down the right and left. We'd only seen a couple up to this point. Maybe they're bugs. I look around and with no car, I start walking down the driveway and my wife on the opposite side. The further I go, the more scary it becomes now. I don't know what it was. I underestimated the amount of bats. I start running because my children are frightened. As soon as I start running, I'm not kidding, they begin to clear a flight path up with my head. They would turn around probably 5 feet from my face or even closer. I'm not exaggerating. As I'm running trying to avoid these, I hear my wife screaming as she beats me home. My daughter's on the verge of tears. She was so scared. And I know bats are absolutely full of different diseases, and that's why I was really scared. Now 9. I personally didn't see this, but it doesn't add up. One Saturday, my husband's parents were over for dinner when he came to me and said, "Hey, my mum saw some girl with a black sundress coming out of the woods and going even further down, trying to reach us, without knowing the layout of the land. I don't know how this person could have came across here. There's no easy way to get to us, and it's not the kind of place that you would travel. This would have meant that whoever this is had basically come out of the middle of nowhere. Why would they be doing this?" And 10. And the last one. Now, if either one of us go out to smoke at night at the window in our bathroom, we often hear a bell sound, kind of like a Chinese ceremonial dong thing. Being skeptical, we presume that these are wind chimes. We looked and there's no wind chimes at my neighbour's house, and the bells sound like they're coming from the southeast side of the property, and we can't explain it. My family loves to go on vacation in Sweden, and my grandmother even has a cottage in the forest that all the family members can use if they want. A couple of years ago, when I was around 20, I was on vacation there with my mum and my grandma sometime in autumn for about 10 days. This is the Swedish backwoods where we go there to unwind, to enjoy the nature and take a rest from civilization, hiking, canoeing and foraging for mushrooms, sitting around the fireplace in the evening and that kind of thing. It's not completely isolated. You can still find a couple of villages and fields here and there. It's definitely not very rural though, and you don't have to encounter people if you don't want to. No, I've always liked to go exploring on my own, finding new paths through the woods, fixing our old maps to better reflect the current landscape. The maps you can buy of this area haven't been updated in ages, and many paths don't exist anymore because nature swallowed them long ago. What I also like is exploring abandoned buildings, and in rural Sweden it's great for that. Back in the 1800s, Swedish people in the countryside were very poor and starving, so they moved to the New World in search of a better life. You can still find the foundations of farmhouses, even the foundations of entire small villages in the woods, sometimes which have been rusted for over 100 years, or farmland equipment there. Also, like so many countries, Sweden has an issue with rural exodus nowadays. Middle-aged and younger people move away to the cities. Old people stay there until they die usually, and nobody buys the house that they once lived in, and it just sits there abandoned. This actually happens quite a lot. You can find many empty houses in the forest, and I love sneaking around in them. Most of them have already been looted, presumably by hunters, loggers and other hikers, but sometimes you can still find interesting things, and lots of things there that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. It's very rare to meet anybody out there in the woods. So one crisp autumn day, I took one of our bicycles, a map. Now GPS is mostly not a thing out there, my phone, but it usually doesn't have reception, and some food and water. Now I did actually tell my mum and grandma, and I wanted to be back by nightfall at the very latest and set out exploring. On the map, I had chose a wide loop that I guessed would take about 3 hours if the paths were clear, and I didn't stop to explore. But even if I did, I guess I had plenty of time until dusk. I had a lot of fun at first, driving the mountain bike down smaller and smaller forest paths, finding foundations of old buildings, and some root cellars that are still intact and have some mushrooms there. I had some problems with the map because, like I said, many of the paths are still there, but no longer exist like they once did, so it's hard to see. So I had to turn back a few times, but I mostly had a pretty good idea of where I was. Of course, that made it take longer than I expected, and when I reached the point furthest from the loop, I go into a narrow path that according to the map would take me back in an hour. Now the sun's already decently low in the sky. At this point I'm feeling a bit uneasy, I have to admit it, because of my bad time management and because I was worried that I could trust the map less than I thought. Also, shortly before turning onto the path, I had found some traps in the wood that kind of creeped me out a bit. They were 3 big cages, each with a platform in the middle that was connected to a steel door in front. On those platforms were some animal remains, rotted with bones sticking out. It hadn't been touched in ages of bait. I guess since the doors were still open though, maybe they climbed in. I had taken a stick and deactivated the traps by putting and pushing onto the platforms through the cage bars. Any hunters might feel that this was a bad move, but I hated the idea of a fox or marten or something being trapped in there. When those doors had snapped shut, it had been so loud that I actually flinched, and afterwards I noticed how quiet it is. Now I was clumsily cycling along on that uneven ground as the sun was setting. I had this uncomfortable feeling that everything was sort of aware of me, if that makes sense. It wasn't the feeling of being watched, but just too quiet. Just quietness, that's it. After a while, I come upon a crossroad in a more open area where I was supposed to follow the path straight on. There were trees not so high here, and I guess that this had been one of those clearings created by a severe storm some 10 years back. Or maybe there had just been loggers in the past, who knows. At the crossroads was a tiny wooden building. Somewhere between a shed and a cabin, I had originally set out to find abandoned houses, and so far had only seen some stone foundations and root cellars. So even at this point, I really should have just hurried to get back, but curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to check this thing out and have a look inside. It wasn't locked, but the door was kind of stuck in the frame for a moment, and I can't tear it loose. Inside of the cabin was a cot, a tiny oven, and massive taxidermy animals everywhere. Now, I didn't think they could fit into this tiny thing. There were too many there. There were even some on the cot and in the oven, now to the ceiling and walls. The entirety of the inside of the cabin also, every inch of it had a thick layer of black mould, so much so that some of the animals you can't actually tell what they once were. Others I could guess from the shape. They all look monstrous covered in that stuff, and the smell of rotten mould is overwhelming. I quickly tried to close the door again, but the wood had warped so much it wasn't quite possible, so I left it hanging slightly open and get out of there. As I was cycling away from the cabin, I felt strange. This time, I did feel like I was being watched, and not kind of nonsensely thinking. I thought, you should have closed the door behind you, you should have done that. I don't know why I thought of this, but it made me uneasy, so it didn't sit right with me. I then think, why does it matter? And tell myself to stop. Maybe 10 minutes later, the path enters a stretch of older woods with much higher trees. The sun was now close to the horizon, and the sky was full of orange light. Under the fir trees, it was getting very dark, and I checked my phone. I want to tell my mum, but of course no reception. A couple more minutes into the dark forest and the path has vanished. At this point I have two options. Try to push through with my bike until I met a logging road, which was hopefully there on the other side of that stretch of woods that could take me back, or even return to get past the mouldy shed again, then try to go my way back home. Basically, the second option was not an option for me, as I'd already said that I would be getting back, and I knew that I was going to have to zigzag and improvise now. Going all the way back would take ages, and I could get more lost going deeper into the darkness. I didn't want to lose my way, but also, I really didn't want to go past the shed again. I had a sudden aversion to even look behind me. As dusk was creeping through the forest, I was getting properly paranoid at this point. The uneasy feeling crystallized into the idea that I had disturbed something there, and that because I left the door open, something was following me now and had come out after me. I know it's stupid, but I cannot shake the feeling. Going past the shed, past those traps and through the ruins of the old village, past the open mouths of the root cellar, and getting into the darkness is a horrible feeling. Now yes, I might get lost trying to go through the woods in front of me, and I would have to push and maybe even carry my bike. But the woods didn't seem to stretch out too far in front, only left and right, so it seemed like the better option now. I was just hoping at this point that the supposed logging road was still there. I mean, it could not be. After tearing through it for a bit, I found what I guessed to be the remnants of an old path because the ground was sort of lower there, and I tried to follow it until I come upon another set of ruins. And again, foundations appear from the farmhouse presumably. Behind that, the ground slopes into a marshy area with birches that seem very white in the gloom of the trees. Now I stop and listen. I still didn't want to turn around. Now I can't hear anything, but I have the ugly feeling of being watched or followed, and it only increases at this point. I felt like not only was something coming after me, but like the forest itself was aware of my presence, listening or watching. Like it was deliberately quiet. I was feeling so scared that I didn't even try to talk myself out of it anymore, and just accepted what I was dealing with. I'd left some food in my backpack. Half a sandwich and some sesame snacks, and then of course, mushrooms I found earlier. I took it all out, laid it out on a stone, and I said, please let me go, I'm sorry. I won't come back, I promise. After that I grabbed my bike and went down into the swamp, still not looking back. Luckily, it turned out it wasn't a large swamp or anything. Really just a wet patch for about 300 meters until the ground sloped upwards again. So, I quickly grab my bike and try and push as hard as I can. Now I'm constantly going through these muddy parts and it's hard not to get stuck. When I emerge on the other side, I was soaked in sweat and my feet were wet and muddy to mid-calf. I stop frequently to listen for anything around me, but there's nothing. And then, wouldn't you know it, the trees opened up and there it is, the loggers' path. I could have cried with joy and relief in this moment. I stepped onto the road and turned back to look behind me, but I can't even see the swamp through the trees anymore. It was almost completely dark by now, but luckily there was some moonlight, and I make my way. I climb on my bike and pedal as fast as I could. About half an hour later, I had some cell reception and managed to call my mum and tell her what happened. Or well, at least say I didn't get lost. I didn't want her to know that I'd worked up in such a panic over something. She was already worried, and that horrible feeling I had back there in the woods eased up gradually. I even start to see some animals now, and I hear an owl and a deer. By the time I arrive at the cabin, I feel okay again, yet exhausted.